So Tony, 10 years ago, you and I got together and you talked to me about the idea, what ultimately became the Georgetown Center on Education in the Workforce. Tell me a little bit about what you had in mind in creating the Georgetown Center.
It was a natural flow for me. I was never an education person. I still don't feel like I know much about education, and you and I have been in, I remember one conversation early on with you and me and some of my staff and a lot of people around a table when it became obvious to you that I didn't understand what had happened in higher education between 1975 and 1982 or something, because the numbers changed and I didn't know why. So I've never been an education person, but through my whole career I've stumbled into it because early on I was a public finance economist. I ended up involved in court cases, one of which went to the Supreme Court and we lost, but it was about education funding in K-12. So then I went to work on the Hill for the budget committees, and I was the jobs guy. I was the labor economist, and if you were the labor economist, you spent most of your time on training bills and education bills, so that I kept getting pulled into it, always feeling a bit insecure because I understood the economics, but I didn't know the policy stuff. And what was going on in all of that, should have dawned on me, is what we were seeing was that education and jobs are becoming the same thing. So in the 1970s, 60 to 70% of the jobs only required a high school degree. In my career, mostly after 1983, after that 80-81 recession, the whole economy shifted so that most of the jobs now require some post-secondary education, some education after high school. So all of us who were jobs people ended up over in the education sphere, whether we liked it or not, in trying to figure out how you can specify what the relationship is between education and jobs. So when you'd been on the education stuff for a long time, I remember you years and years ago, you were explained to me as the guy who does equity stuff in higher education, especially Hispanics.
Right.
And I don't,
Right.
to this day, don't know quite what that meant.
Yep.
But
Did a lot of research in that space. As a recovering researcher, that work was really important to me. It still is now in terms of our work at Lumina Foundation.
well, that was your good guy description.
Yeah.
People said to me, Jamie's a higher education guy who pays attention to equity.
Yeah.
So you were always okay with me. So, but in any event, that's really how it happened. And the world created this new space. You and I both were sort of set up for it.
So why did we need a research center, though? What was the need? What was the gap that needed to be filled in this intersection between work and learning?
We needed to understand, first of all, how it worked. We needed to understand, first of all, needed to tell people that that had happened. Most of the American public, policy people, were very slow to recognize that the relationship between education, especially post-secondary education, and work and careers was really powerful and growing more powerful, and it has ever since. So somebody needed to say that. There were economists around who were saying at a very superficial level that the more education you got, the better off you'd be, but nobody was specifying that relationship down to where you went to school, what you took in school, what the pathways looked like. And there were a whole host of people who were still, in some cases economists, who are still saying that that relationship doesn't exist. You don't need to go to college. All that's happening is people are becoming overqualified. So we became, I was at the Education Testing Service then. The reason I was there is I was sort of the guy at the front end of every meeting, often education meetings, who gave that talk explaining what had happened with education and the economy, and then they'd go off and talk about education. So that was the initial impetus for all this, and in some ways, my career made me perfect for that.
Right. I remember when we got together 10 years ago, we had lunch. I think it was at a Turkish restaurant at DuPont Circle in Washington, D.C., and we were talking about this idea of the center, and you said to me, we have a data problem in this business. We have a problem on both sides of the equation, on the education side and on the workforce side. And if we can figure out how to create more open data and how to bring these data sets together, we'll actually have a powerful story to tell about this integration of learning and working that's taking place in society right now. So you look back on it on the last decade, it's essentially what you've done at the center. Tell me a little bit about sort of where you think we are in terms of the data questions, and have we made progress in helping people understand more about why these two systems are integrated?
Well, our own work and the work of lots of other people, as a result of that, I think, in a sense, the check is in the mail. That is, I think we've made the case. You can't find, hard to find a politician who stands in front of a room nowadays and doesn't say that people need some form of formal preparation beyond high school in order to get a good job. Now, what they do is they'll stop there and say, but maybe we ought to put vocational education back into high school,
right,
so we can train people in high school and stop doing this stuff that we decided to do with the Nation at Risk report in 1983, which is to give everybody a solid academic education through high school. The reason they have difficulty reinstalling voc ed back in high school is because that's tracking. If you install voc ed in high school, African American, Latino, and other minorities, and working class whites and low income kids will be on that track. And in '83, we pretty much decided as a nation, with a Nation at Risk, that we were going to give everybody a solid basic education through high school, both to make things more fair and because it was becoming clear in the economy that you needed that and something even more to have a good job and a good career. So it has been widely accepted now. The way, I'll tell you where I think it's going, and that is that if you stand up in front of an audience and you say, you're very safe if you say, everybody needs something beyond high school to get a good job. Most every politician will say that now.
right.
You can't say, but everybody needs a BA. Because in the audience, to some extent, unfortunately, most of the people will think, well, my kid is worthy of a BA and prepared and qualified, but those other kids are not. So the safe position now is 14 is the new 12. That is, get a couple more years of education, get a certificate, a one-year award in a particular field, and so on and so forth. I think where the country is politically and where we'll go in the next few years is we're going to make 14 the new 12. There is some possibility that we'll do free higher education, but I don't think we'll get there within the next few years.
I want to come back to that issue in a minute. The issue of, you've been an advocate. You're a researcher, but you also have a point of view. You've been an advocate for equity, but at the same time, you've warned about the dangers of this race-based tracking that you were talking about. So how do you reconcile those for audiences? I think some people might hear hesitation to talk about race when you emphasize that we shouldn't be doing race-based tracking. I think what you're saying is that there's danger in tracking people into patterns that actually inhibit their eventual success. But
yes.
Tell me a little bit more about your perspective on that.
In the United States, we'll always do that. It's who we are, unfortunately. We will track what's happening with this message, 14 is the new 12, which is avoids tracking because it takes the tracking issue out of K-12 education because everybody gets 14 years of schooling. So suddenly you're not in that conversation anymore. And minority community, the labor movement, and others who speak for them will be comfortable. The hard part of that is what's also going on is, and I hear this all the time, it's never said directly, but I hear it between the lines, which is, yes, there are a lot of good jobs for which you need 1 year of training beyond high school. In some cases, you could probably do it in high school, or 2 years of training beyond high school, and kids will make more than a lot of people who get BAs. That's absolutely true. But it's always said in conversations about what we can do for African Americans, Latinos, and working class people. So the tracking issue that used to be a K-12 issue, it's come back to a certain extent because we're now graduating half the people, not quite half, 48% of high school graduates never get a post-secondary award, or at least within 8 years of their graduation from high school. So we're still failing. We're giving people academic education all the way through high school, all the way through Algebra 2. But in the end, a lot of them are left behind because they don't succeed in post-secondary education. So there's a temptation to push voc ed back into high school. That causes a bloody political fight. My own bias about this is that there's a realistic view and an idealistic view. The realist in me, because I do sit on a board or two where the issue is dealing with kids who are disadvantaged and oftentimes in trouble. And when you sit down with somebody who's 16 years old and threatening to drop out of school, or have someone who has dropped out of school, what you have to do is whatever's going to work next. So oftentimes what will work next is to put them in some sort of alternative school where they can learn a skill. Usually that's what they're after. They don't want to go back to school. They don't want Algebra 2. So the realists, and those tend to be the people closest to the ground, you hear that all the time from high school principals and people like that. The idealistic view is we shouldn't be doing that. So you have to decide, and there is ambivalence in it for me, are you going to hold other people's lives to a standard that allows you to satisfy your own ideals, or are you going to give them what they need next? Now, the obvious answer for this is next isn't forever. Next should always lead to further education, further career preparation. It should be a highway with exits and on-ramps and no dead ends. And that's really the ideal. But in America, there's always the danger that we'll track.
So you mentioned 14 is the new 12. 14 is the new 12 is a sort of nice way to describe the fact that you need more post-high school learning. At the same time, it implies a time factor, right? That 14 years of schooling is better than 12 years of schooling. But I also think you and I agree that time is becoming less and less important than what you learn, right? And the credentials that are associated with the learning is really the most important thing. Tell me a little bit about your view on not just BAs, as you mentioned earlier, but also all of the other kinds of credentials that already exist, and maybe some of the new ones that are emerging. How do we get to that point where people have a high-quality credential at the end of that 14 that positions them well for success in working in life?
Well, the good news about 14 is the new 12 is it allows you, especially if you're a politician in front of the crowd, to say, I'm good on that issue.
Right.
And then hope nobody asks another question.
Right.
Because the question is, first of all, what the hell are you talking about?
Right, exactly.
And secondly, what's in that 14? So there is this issue that we've got to have to think hard about what's in that 14. And we do know that, in fact, it is true, in this new game, and it is new since the 80s, you can get a 1-year certificate and make more than many people with BAs. 30% of people with 2-year degrees make more than people with BAs. 44%, I think, of BA graduates make more than people with graduate degrees. All depends on the field you're in. Exactly. All depends on what you know specifically. The fly in the ointment there, which is something we've only learned recently, at the center and work that we're doing over the next year or so is that, in fact, while there are wide differences in earnings by field, within any field, if it does have a certificate to 2-year to BA to graduate, and a lot of certificates don't, but within any field, the BA is the degree that gives you the most flexibility. The BA and the graduate degree, most flexibility over the long term, and that's true for, that's true for individuals, and it's true for whole economies.
So if you look at the data on what you just talked about in terms of the all credentials post high school have value, but at the same time there's differences in terms of the labor market value of certain credentials in certain fields. The BA is giving you the greatest flexibility. So how do you reconcile those things? In other words, you have certificates, certifications, lots of other types of credentials, as well as degrees, particularly the BA having the greatest labor market potential. How do you create a system where there's an overall strategy here where people continue to advance in terms of their work lives, in terms of their personal success, while accumulating these credentials that bring them through that system?
Well, there's an easy and quick general answer to that. There's a lot of pieces and money missing to get it done, a lot of transparency and accountability missing to get it done. But the easy answer is, in the end, it's a democracy. In a democracy, we're supposed to give people choices. And we trust people to make choices with the proper counseling, which they don't get. And that in the end, there should always be, as Lumina says, and I think you people pretty much nailed it among the foundations on this, and you stuck with this through hot and heavy debates about education for its own sake. It turns out that that education for its own sake has economic value. Right. The truth is that you give people choices, but there should always be another door to go through, whether it's more education or more career-related learning. We have not built a system like that. Just saying 14 is the new 12, for instance, you're cutting across at least 3 governmental and institutional silos, because the 14 is the new 12 idea really begins with career exploration in middle school, internships in high school, more direct exploration in post-secondary education, so that in the end it's a systems change that isn't just higher ed. It's higher ed looking backward to the high schools, and beneath that, even before that, and the high schools looking forward to higher education. Well, these institutions are funded separately, governed separately, so people then say, well, that's not going to happen. In the end, you may not be able to get one boss for the whole system, but you can build transparency for the whole system. You can make the high schools responsible by following the students.
So the change is structural, right? So you've got to create new systems that focus on the education before college, or high school and below. You've got to create changes within the traditional learning structure, higher education, and then you've got to create changes in workplace-based learning and all of the other sort of more informal approaches to learning. All of that's got to be part of some ecosystem where there's transparency. To your point, how do we do that? How do we actually create that transparency without it being one big government function, which I don't think anybody wants?
In the end, you do it the way we're able to do things in the 21st century in every domain of American life, and that is you do it with data, in my judgment. That is, the transparency is something you can clearly do with data. You may not be able to change the boxes on the organization chart of the American economy and education system, because they're governed and run separately, and for good reason in many cases, but you can connect the dots between all these things. You can make it transparent. Once you make it transparent, you can then build policy to make it work better. And the policy, the strongest one, is to make it transparent to the students so that they, in the end, know what the pathways are. And they, in the end, understand what their option is, what's next, what they can do later. I don't think, in the end, the governance questions are really difficult. Although I do think, in the end, because I see it going on, that more and more the border between, say, high school and college, that boundary line is melting.
Yeah, I've been talking about the idea that I think in our lifetimes you are going to see the end of the temporal model of learning, right? This idea that society expects that first you learn, then you work. I think what we're starting to experience already is the end of that system, and I think it will be obliterated in the coming decades because the changing nature of work and what's expected of people is going to require them to continue to learn and work. You know, I don't know what we'll call ourselves. I don't think we're going to say students anymore. I think we're going to say learner workers, something like that, because over the course of a lifetime, you'll be learning and working to advance your skills to do human work in an increasingly technology-mediated world. So that's going to require dramatic change, as you say, both in structure and in terms of the system. Does that mean, though, that we're going to see the end of majors, of, you know, we've had this ongoing debate about will we continue to need liberal arts going forward? Will we need those kind of traditional ways of learning on a pathway that gets you to a credential in a specific field, or are we going to be focused more on these broader learning models?
I think in the end there is a horizontal and a vertical dimension to this. That is, we know that the combination of liberal arts education and a solid major, one that has some labor market value, adds value in economic terms. It also, by the way, does something else that is really relevant nowadays, and that is we're involved at the center in an international project with the European Union using their data and our data. We're running the American data, they're running the European data. And what it shows, and I'm enough of a skeptic to have thought going into this, it's not going to work out the way everybody wants it to. Numbers don't oftentimes. But we've run, for a year now, been running data, and what it says very clearly is that education beyond high school and the mix of what in America we call liberal arts education, which is something beyond a specific major, the mix of general education and specific education is the strongest antidote to the formation of the authoritarian personality. So, the American system, and I was sure this wasn't going to be true because the American system is so disorganized and the European system is so organized. The American system is stronger than the European systems in this particular regard, which leaves me, because my own bias, and you know this, that is if you go to, there are people in liberal arts colleges that try mightily to knit this all together with a project at the end that unifies all the learning. People are moving in that direction. But mostly it's been about, if you're the economics department, making sure that the students had to take at least one and maybe two economics courses because it was something you had to have to keep your job. But in the end, the American system seems to be more powerful in that regard because the European university is apparently more narrow in its focus than the American university. So there are a lot of questions here that, at least analytically and intellectually, one, they're sort of encouraging.
Right.
I mean, why not a world in which human capital, that is human beings, have more and more value, and education has more and more value? I think this is what the founders, particularly Jefferson, I think this is what they thought they were trying to build.
So I want to go back to where we started, which was, so it's been a decade since you created the center, and over that time period you've tried to use data to tell the story about the convergence of education in the workforce, of working and learning. But in that time period, we've seen dramatic changes in the way that you can actually disseminate that information to help people understand it. There's new media channels, there's new opportunities for helping to tell those stories. How do you do that? You're a research center doing very serious work as economists. You don't want to sort of dumb down the product. You want to make sure that it has the highest level of integrity. At the same time, there's a cacophony of information out there now, and you've got to be able to tell the story in a way that people can actually access it. How do you tell those stories? How do you do that work?
Well, it's precisely what you say. It's telling a story. It's starting out with the intention of telling a story. So my own bias is the advantage we've had over others over these 10 years is, one, we're a center that has a relatively strong focus, and over time we're an asset in the sense that we stay focused on our question. It's not just a study here or a study there. It builds. The second thing is that all of our studies start with, what's the question? And why are we asking this question? And what will be, and it gets even more slippery than that, because my first question is, what's the headline when we're done?
Right.
And if that's the first meeting that goes on. Sometimes there is no headline, because there is work that we do that is just due diligence, that is tracking the value of associate's degrees, certificates, tracking the value of industry-based certifications. Will only be interested to people like you and people in the education community.
Sure.
But one of the things we do is that we do the spade work. That is, when new data comes out, we run the data, see did something change with certificates, what are the value of AA, constantly trying to figure out the value of industry-based certifications and new kinds of degrees and so on. That we think of, we actually talk about it as mapping. We have a mapping function to understand the terrain. But then there's much of the rest of what we do answers questions, whether they're equity questions or efficiency questions in higher ed, or even something broader like this business we're doing with the European Union on authoritarianism and its relationship to education.
Tony, this has been great. Time has flown by. Thank you very much for spending
Thank
the
you.
time with me. We don't get a chance to do this very
No, we
much,
don't.
and I've really enjoyed our chance to do this. Good luck in the next decade for the center.
Yeah, thank you.